When 8th Dan Aikido master and billionaire heiress Victoria Kane stepped into her pristine dojo that Tuesday evening, she expected the usual reverent silence. What she didn't expect was the janitor who kept mopping, completely ignoring her presence. "Care to spar?" she challenged, her voice cutting through the hushed hall. Michael Rowan looked up from his mop, a single father with calloused hands and quiet eyes, and smiled. "Only if you promise not to cry." In that moment, the marble armor of a woman who controlled empires cracked for the first time in 18 years. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels now. Let me take you into a tale of pride loss and the unexpected places where we find our greatest strength. The Kane Metropolitan Dojo stood like a monument to perfection in downtown Seattle, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft glow of traditional paper lanterns. Every surface gleamed, every mat lay precisely aligned, every piece of equipment maintained to museum quality. It was Tuesday, 7:47 p.m., and the evening advanced class was about to begin. Victoria Kane's Maserati pulled into her reserved parking space with the whisper-quiet precision of German engineering. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see her students already kneeling in Caesar, their white gi pristine, their postures perfect. They knew she would arrive at exactly 7:50 p.m. as she had every Tuesday for the past 3 years. Punctuality, like everything else in Victoria's world, was non-negotiable. At 34, Victoria Kane commanded a business empire worth $2.3 billion. Kane Industries had risen from her grandfather's modest shipping company to a multinational conglomerate spanning technology, real estate, and renewable energy. Forbes had called her the Ice Phoenix, beautiful, untouchable, and rising from the ashes of every competitor who dared challenge her dominance. But here in this dojo, she was something more, something deeper. Victoria Kane was an 8th Dan master of Aikido, a rank that typically required decades to achieve. She had earned it in 12 years through a combination of natural talent, obsessive dedication, and the kind of ruthless perfectionism that had built her empire. The black belt around her waist wasn't just fabric and cotton. It was a symbol of the only thing in her life that money couldn't buy: mastery earned through sweat, pain, and absolute commitment. She stepped out of her car, her designer athletic wear perfectly tailored, her long auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Even in workout clothes, Victoria Kane looked like she belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Power radiated from her like heat from a forge. The dojo's entrance doors were crafted from imported Japanese cedar, each plank hand-selected and fitted by master carpenters. They opened silently at her approach, responding to motion sensors that cost more than most people's cars. The familiar scent of tatami mats and incense enveloped her as she stepped inside. "Sensei Kane," her students murmured in unison, their heads bowing in perfect synchronization. 23 advanced practitioners, each one a black belt in their own right, each one treating her arrival like the entrance of royalty. Victoria nodded curtly, her sharp green eyes scanning the training floor with the intensity of a general inspecting troops. Everything was exactly as it should be. The mirrors spotless, the weapons rack organized with military precision, the temperature precisely controlled at 68 degrees. This was her sanctuary, the one place in her world where chaos could not penetrate. But tonight, something was different. In the far corner of the dojo, near the equipment storage area, a man was mopping the floor. He moved with slow, methodical strokes, completely absorbed in his work. The soft swish of the mop across the polished wood created a rhythm that seemed oddly out of place in the reverent silence of the training hall. Victoria's eyes narrowed. The cleaning crew was supposed to finish their work before evening classes began. This was a violation of protocol, a disruption to the sacred atmosphere she had spent years cultivating. The man was tall, but not imposing, probably in his mid-30s, with sandy brown hair that needed a trim and shoulders that spoke of honest labor rather than gym workouts. His janitor's uniform was clean but worn the kind of practical clothing that prioritized function over form. He moved with an economy of motion that struck Victoria as oddly graceful, each stroke of the mop deliberate and efficient. What bothered her most was his complete lack of awareness of her presence. Every person in this building knew who she was. Executives crossed streets to avoid her displeasure. CEOs scheduled their calendars around her availability. Yet this janitor continued his work as if she were invisible. "Excuse me," Victoria called out, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had silenced boardrooms full of men twice her age. The man paused, looked up and smiled. It wasn't the nervous, eager-to-please expression she was accustomed to receiving from service staff. It was calm, unhurried, and somehow amused. "Evening," he said simply, then returned to his mopping. Victoria felt a spark of irritation flare in her chest. She walked across the training floor, her bare feet silent on the polished wood, her students' eyes following her movement with barely concealed fascination. Confrontations were rare in the dojo, and when they occurred, they were usually brief and decisive. "I'm Victoria Kane," she said, stopping just outside the wet area he had been cleaning. "This is my dojo." The man straightened up, leaning on his mop handle. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a warm brown like coffee with cream, and they held a depth that seemed inconsistent with his humble occupation. There were lines around those eyes, the kind that came from smiling often, but also from squinting into harsh light and difficult truths. "Michael Rowan," he replied, extending a hand that was clean despite his work. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Kane." His handshake was firm without being aggressive, calloused without being rough. Victoria found herself momentarily off balance. Most people who worked in her building treated her like a force of nature to be navigated carefully. This Michael Rowan seemed to regard her as simply another person. "Classes begin at 8 o'clock sharp," she said, her voice taking on the edge that made junior executives break into cold sweats. "The cleaning schedule should accommodate that." "Should be done in about 10 minutes, Michael replied, completely unruffled by her tone. "Sorry for the inconvenience." He started to turn back to his work, and Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Someone was dismissing her. Not through fear or incompetence, but simply because he had a job to finish, and she wasn't going to stop him from finishing it. "Actually," she heard herself saying the words, coming from some impulse she didn't recognize. "Since you're here, would you like to spar?" The silence that fell over the dojo was absolute. 23 black belts held their breath in collective shock. Victoria Kane never invited casual participants to train. The advanced class was reserved for practitioners with years of experience and proven dedication. Asking the janitor to spar was like asking a passerby to conduct the Seattle Symphony. Michael stopped mopping and turned to face her fully. For a moment, Victoria thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. Then that calm smile returned. "That's kind of you to offer," he said. "But I'm not really dressed for it." "I could lend you a jo," Victoria replied, not entirely sure why she was pursuing this. "Unless you're concerned about embarrassing yourself in front of the class." It was a calculated provocation, the kind of challenge she used in business negotiations to force opponents into hasty decisions. Most people would either back down or accept out of wounded pride. Michael Rowan did neither. He studied her face for a long moment, those coffee-colored eyes seeming to see something that made him almost chuckle. You sure about that, Ms. Kane? I'm sure about most things, Victoria replied. Are you afraid? Not of sparring, Michael said. But I have to ask, are you certain you want to do this? There was something in his tone that made Victoria's competitive instincts flare. It wasn't arrogance or bravado. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and who wasn't impressed by titles or reputations. I'm an 8th Dan Master, she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind him exactly who he was talking to. I think I can handle whatever you might bring to the mat. Michael nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed something he had suspected. He propped his mop against the wall and walked over to where she stood. The wet floor gleamed behind him like a mirror. All right then, he said, his smile widening just slightly. But only if you promise not to cry. The words hit the dojo like a physical force. Victoria felt her face flush, her hands clench involuntarily at her sides. In 34 years of life, no one had ever spoken to her with such casual disrespect. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies addressed her with more deference. Government officials requested meetings with more humility. But there was something about the way he said it that stopped her from unleashing the verbal barrage that was building in her throat. It wasn't malicious or mocking. It was almost playful. As if he were sharing a private joke that she hadn't quite gotten yet. I beg your pardon, she managed to say, her voice carefully controlled. I said only if you promise not to cry. Michael repeated, completely unperturbed by the murderous look she was giving him. It's just that you seem like someone who takes losing pretty hard, and I'd hate to ruin your evening. Behind her, Victoria could hear the barely suppressed gasps of her students. Someone was about to witness either the most spectacular humiliation of an overconfident janitor or the impossible spectacle of Victoria Kane being taken down a peg by a man in work clothes. Victoria Kane had built her empire on the principle that backing down was never an option. She had faced down hostile takeover attempts, regulatory investigations, and boardroom coups without flinching. She had earned her martial arts rank by defeating opponents who had been training since before she was born. The idea that a janitor might pose any kind of threat was so absurd it bordered on insulting. And yet, there was something about Michael Rowan that didn't fit the picture. The way he moved suggested an athlete, not a custodian. The confidence in his voice spoke of experience that went beyond mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Most importantly, his complete lack of intimidation in her presence suggested either remarkable stupidity or remarkable capability. Victoria Kane hadn't become one of the most successful people in the world by avoiding challenges, even ridiculous ones. Fine, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. Let's see what you've got. The advanced class watched in stunned silence as their sensei walked to the equipment storage area and retrieved a guest guy in Michael's size. The white cotton uniform was crisp and new, still bearing the creases from its packaging. Michael accepted it with a nod of thanks and headed toward the changing area. This is insane, whispered Jenny Martinez, a 3rd Dan black belt, who had been training with Victoria for 2 years. She's going to destroy him. She should, agreed David Kim, a former Marine whose military precision had earned him rapid advancement in the ranks. But did you see how he moved? Something's off about this guy. What do you mean off? Asked Sarah Chen, the dojo's most technical fighter. I mean, he moves like he knows how to fight, David replied quietly. Real fighting, not just martial arts. Victoria pretended not to hear their whispered conversation as she performed her own warm-up routine. She moved through a series of stretches and basic techniques with fluid precision, her body responding to commands honed by thousands of hours of practice. Her form was textbook perfect, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. But even as she prepared her body for combat, her mind was racing with questions she couldn't answer. Why had she challenged a complete stranger to spar? Why did his casual dismissal of her status bother her so much? And why did that knowing smile of his make her feel like she was missing something important? Michael emerged from the changing area wearing the borrowed GI, and Victoria felt her first moment of genuine surprise. The uniform fit him perfectly, but more than that, he wore it like someone accustomed to the weight and feel of martial arts clothing. His stance was natural, his posture correct without being rigid. The playful janitor was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he belonged on a training mat. "Ready when you are, Ms. Kane," he said, bowing formally. Victoria returned the bow, noting that his form was precise without being showy. Traditional, but not slavishly so. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. They moved to the center of the training floor, circling each other slowly. Victoria let her mind settle into the familiar rhythm of combat assessment. She cataloged her opponent's height, reach, likely speed, and probable experience level based on how he moved and positioned himself. Michael Rowan was about 6 feet tall, giving him a slight height advantage. His reach would be longer than hers, but Victoria had fought taller opponents before. His stance suggested some formal training, but it was difficult to determine which discipline or how advanced. He moved with the relaxed alertness of someone comfortable with physical confrontation, but that could mean anything from a few years of weekend classes to decades of serious study. What struck her most was his composure. He wasn't trying to intimidate her with aggressive posturing, nor was he showing the nervous energy of someone out of his depth. He was simply present, waiting to see what she would do. Victoria decided to test his defenses with a basic Irimi technique, entering his space with a diagonal movement designed to disrupt his balance. It was a fundamental Aikido approach, one that would reveal how well he understood the principles of the art. She stepped forward, and to the right, her hand reaching for his wrist, in a movement so practiced it was almost unconscious. It should have been a simple matter to redirect his energy and take him to the ground. Instead, Michael's wrist simply wasn't there when her hand arrived. He had moved with her, matching her timing so precisely that her technique found only empty air. It wasn't a block or a counter. He had simply flowed around her attack like water around a stone. Victoria felt a flicker of genuine surprise. That kind of timing required years of experience and exceptional spatial awareness. She reset her position and tried again, this time with a different angle of approach. Again, Michael flowed away from her technique with minimal effort. He wasn't fighting her so much as dancing with her, matching her movements with an ease that spoke of deep understanding. "Interesting style," Victoria commented, circling to her left. "Where did you train?" "Here and there," Michael replied. His attention focused on her center of gravity. "You're very good. Technical precision is excellent." The compliment should have pleased her, but something in his tone suggested it was qualified, as if her technique was impressive but somehow incomplete. Victoria decided to increase the pressure. She launched into a series of more complex attacks, testing different angles and rhythms. Each time, Michael responded with just enough movement to avoid her techniques, never more than necessary, never wasted motion. What was becoming clear was that he wasn't trying to attack her at all. He was simply neutralizing everything she threw at him with what appeared to be minimal effort. It was like fighting smoke. No matter how precisely she struck, there was nothing solid to connect with. After 5 minutes of this, Victoria was beginning to breathe hard. Not from physical exertion, but from the mounting frustration of being completely unable to land a technique on someone who should have been overwhelmed within the first 30 seconds. "Are you planning to actually spar or just avoid me all evening?" she asked, her voice carrying more edge than she intended. Michael's smile returned, and for the first time he initiated movement. He stepped toward her with what looked like a simple grab for her wrist, one of the most basic attacks taught in introductory classes. Victoria moved to deflect the grab with a standard iriminage technique, confident that his elementary approach would finally give her the opening she needed to demonstrate the difference in their skill levels. What happened next would replay in her mind for weeks to come. Michael's initial movement was indeed a feint, but it was so perfectly timed and positioned that Victoria's response to it put her in exactly the position he wanted her. As she moved to counter his apparent attack, he simply continued his motion, blending with her defensive technique, until suddenly she was the one being redirected. She felt her balance shift, her center of gravity moving away from her base of support. Instinctively, she tried to recover, but Michael was already there, his hands providing just enough pressure to keep her momentum flowing in the direction he had chosen. Victoria Kane, 8th Dan Master of Aikido, found herself being taken to the ground by a janitor using what appeared to be her own technique against her. She hit the mat with a controlled fall, her years of training preventing any injury. But as she rolled back to her feet, she was forced to confront a reality that challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her abilities. The silence in the dojo was absolute. 23 black belts stared in shock at their supposedly invincible sensei, who had just been outmaneuvered by a maintenance worker with apparent ease. But Victoria's attention was entirely focused on Michael, who stood relaxed and ready, that same calm smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You telegraph your intentions about half a second before you move," Michael replied matter-of-factly. "And you rely too heavily on technique instead of intuition. Very pretty form, but it's all surface level." The criticism hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had spent 12 years perfecting those techniques, earning recognition from masters across 3 continents. Her form was considered exemplary by every instructor she had ever worked with. "That's impossible," she said. "I've been training since I was 15. I've competed at international levels." "I believe it," Michael replied. "Your technical knowledge is impressive, but you fight like someone who learned from books instead of experience. I've had thousands of hours of mat time with world-class instructors." Victoria shot back, her famous temper beginning to flare. "Against other students following the same rules you follow," Michael observed. "When's the last time you sparred with someone who didn't know they were supposed to lose to you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria wanted to dismiss it, to point out that her ranking spoke for itself, that she had earned her position through legitimate competition. But as she thought about it, she realized that Michael might have a point. In her dojo, she was the undisputed authority. Students came to learn from her, not to defeat her. In competitions, opponents knew her reputation and often defeated themselves through intimidation before the match even began. In business, her martial arts background was part of her mystique, but it was never actually tested. When was the last time she had faced someone who had no reason to defer to her authority? Someone who didn't care about her rank or her reputation or her ability to make their life difficult. "Again," she said, settling back into her fighting stance. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria threw everything she had at Michael Rowan. She used techniques from her extensive repertoire combinations she had perfected through years of study approaches that had earned her victories in tournaments across the country. Michael neutralized them all with what appeared to be casual ease. He never struck her, never used excessive force, never showed any sign of aggression. He simply moved around her attacks like water flowing around stones, occasionally redirecting her energy when she overcommitted to a technique. It was the most comprehensive and humiliating defeat of Victoria's adult life, made worse by the fact that it didn't feel like a defeat at all. Michael never tried to dominate or embarrass her. He simply demonstrated with quiet consistency that her years of training had prepared her for a kind of fighting that bore little resemblance to actual conflict. When she finally stepped back, breathing hard and covered in sweat, Victoria found herself facing a truth she had never encountered before. She had no idea who she really was when stripped of her advantages. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she asked, her voice hoarse with exertion. "I was a firefighter for 8 years," Michael replied, his own breathing barely elevated. "You learn a lot about reading people when their lives depend on your ability to predict what they'll do under stress." Victoria caught the past tense. Something flickered across Michael's expression, a shadow that suggested pain carefully buried. "Career ended a few years ago. Medical discharge." He didn't elaborate, and Victoria found herself curious about what could have forced a man who moved like Michael Rowan out of emergency services. But before she could ask, a small voice from the observation area interrupted her thoughts. "Dad, are you done playing with the lady?" Victoria turned to see a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing near the dojo's entrance. He had Michael's sandy brown hair and the same calm, observant eyes. He was wearing a school backpack and holding what appeared to be a folded piece of paper. "Almost Noah," Michael called back. "Give me just a minute." The boy nodded and settled onto one of the benches near the entrance, pulling out a sketch pad and beginning to draw with the focused concentration that children brought to activities that truly captured their interest. "Your son?" Victoria asked. "Yeah," Michael replied, his entire demeanor softening as he looked toward the boy. "Noah. He comes here after school while I finish work. Hope that's all right." Victoria found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure why. The dojo had strict policies about unauthorized visitors, especially children. But something about the quiet boy sketching in the corner didn't feel like a violation of her carefully maintained order. "He's welcome," she heard herself saying. Michael's smile returned, but this time it was different. Warmer. The smile of a father who had just heard his child accepted by someone whose opinion mattered. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." As they bowed to formally end their sparring session, Victoria found herself studying Michael's face with the intensity she usually reserved for analyzing quarterly reports. The playful janitor who had challenged her was gone, replaced by a complex man whose depths she was only beginning to suspect. "Same time next week?" Michael asked as he headed toward the changing area. Victoria nodded before she could stop herself. "Same time next week." As Michael changed back into his work clothes and collected his son, Victoria stood in the center of her dojo, trying to process what had just happened. Her students had dispersed quickly after the demonstration, sensing that their sensei needed time to think. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria Kane felt truly uncertain about something fundamental to her identity. She had built her life on the premise that superior skill applied with sufficient intensity could overcome any obstacle. Her business success proved the theory. Her martial arts achievements seemed to confirm it. But Michael Rowan had just demonstrated that her understanding of her own abilities was built on assumptions that crumbled under actual testing. He had dismantled her technique with such ease that it felt less like defeat and more like education. As father and son prepared to leave, Noah approached her with the shy boldness that children sometimes displayed around adults they found interesting. "I drew this for you," he said, holding out the paper he had been working on. Victoria accepted the drawing and felt her breath catch. It was a sketch of 2 figures sparring, rendered with the kind of detail that suggested genuine artistic talent. But what struck her wasn't the technical skill. It was the way the boy had captured something in the two fighters that she hadn't even realized was there. In Noah's drawing, the two sparring partners weren't opponents. They were dancers, their movements complementing each other, their energy flowing in harmony rather than conflict. It was a child's interpretation of what he had witnessed, but it revealed something that Victoria's competitive mindset had missed entirely. "This is beautiful," she said, meaning it completely. "Thank you." Noah beamed and ran back to his father, who was waiting by the door. As they left, Victoria heard the boy ask, "Dad, why was the lady crying during the sparring?" "She wasn't crying, Noah," Michael replied gently. "Sometimes when people discover something new about themselves, their eyes water a little, like when you taste something really spicy, but it's actually delicious." The door closed behind them, leaving Victoria alone in her perfect dojo, with Noah's drawing in her hands, and tears she hadn't realized were falling, drying on her cheeks. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria Kane had encountered something that money couldn't buy, reputation couldn't intimidate, and technique couldn't overcome. She had met someone who saw past her carefully constructed facade to something raw and unfinished beneath. As she locked up the dojo that night, Victoria found herself thinking not about quarterly projections or strategic initiatives, but about the quiet confidence in Michael Rowan's eyes and the way his son had captured something true in a simple pencil sketch. She had built an empire by always knowing exactly what she wanted and how to get it. But as she drove home through the Seattle streets, Victoria Kane found herself wanting something she couldn't name from a man who had just proven that everything she thought she knew about herself might be wrong. The marble armor she had worn for so long felt heavier than usual as she walked into her penthouse apartment. And for the first time in years, Victoria wondered if protection and strength were the same thing after all. The following Tuesday arrived with the weight of unfinished business. Victoria found herself checking the clock in her corner office more frequently than usual, watching the hands crawl toward evening. She had spent the week replaying every moment of her encounter with Michael Rowan, analyzing it like a failed merger or a lost contract. But unlike business problems, this one resisted her usual methods of solution. She had tried researching him through her usual channels. A few discreet inquiries had yielded basic information. Michael Rowan, 36 years old, former Seattle Fire Department medical discharge 3 years prior, current employment, with citywide cleaning services. Single father, no criminal record, unremarkable credit history. The kind of background that revealed nothing and everything at once. What the reports couldn't capture was the way he had moved on that mat, or the quiet confidence that had made her feel like a student rather than a master. They certainly couldn't explain why she had spent the better part of a week thinking about a man who mopped floors for a living. Victoria Kane didn't dwell on people. She identified what she needed from them, obtained it efficiently, and moved on to the next objective. Personal relationships were strategic alliances carefully managed and clearly defined. The idea that a 30-minute sparring session with a janitor could occupy so much of her mental energy was both unprecedented and deeply unsettling. At 6:30 p.m., she closed her laptop and gathered her workout gear. Her assistant, Margaret, looked up in surprise as Victoria headed for the elevator. "Your dinner with the Chen Industries representatives isn't until 9, Margaret reminded her. "And you have 3 calls to return before then." "Reschedule the dinner," Victoria said without slowing down. "Take messages on the calls." "But Ms. Kane, the Chen deal will survive one evening without my attention." Victoria finished stepping into the elevator. "Handle it, Margaret. That's what I pay you for." The elevator doors closed on Margaret's shocked expression. In 5 years of working for Victoria, The assistant had never known her to cancel a business dinner for anything less than a board-level crisis. The fact that she was doing it to return to a martial arts class she could attend any evening of the week was completely out of character. But Victoria found herself driving toward the dojo with something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. She arrived earlier than usual, hoping to observe Michael and his son before the formal class began. The parking lot held only a few cars, and through the windows she could see the boy, Noah, sitting in his usual spot on the observation bench. He was sketching again, his small face serious with concentration. Victoria entered quietly, noting that Michael was finishing his cleaning routine in a different section of the building. The main training floor was pristine, ready for the evening session. Without quite planning it, she found herself walking over to where Noah sat. "What are you drawing tonight?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. Noah looked up with those thoughtful brown eyes so much like his father's. For a moment, he seemed to be deciding whether she was someone worth talking to. Then he held up his sketch pad. "Cranes," he said simply. "Paper cranes, but I'm trying to figure out how they'd look if they were real." The drawing was remarkably sophisticated for a child his age. He had captured the essence of origami birds in flight, but given them feathers and muscle and the fluid grace of living creatures. It was beautiful and somehow melancholic at the same time. "They're lovely," Victoria said, meaning it. "Do you fold paper cranes too, or just draw them?" "Both," Noah replied. "Dad taught me. He says my mom used to make them when she was sad because folding them made her feel better." The casual reference to his mother hit Victoria unexpectedly. She had assumed Michael was divorced, but the way Noah spoke suggested something more permanent, more final. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said carefully. "He is," Noah agreed. "But he gets sad sometimes too, especially when he thinks I'm not looking." There was something achingly mature about the boy's observation. Victoria found herself wondering what kind of loss could leave such thoughtful shadows in a child's eyes. "Noah," Michael's voice carried across the dojo as he emerged from the back hallway pushing a utility cart. "You bothering Ms. Kane?" "She asked about my drawings," Noah called back. "I'm not bothering, I'm sharing." Michael's expression softened as he looked at his son, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the deep affection that connected them. It was uncomplicated in a way that made her chest feel tight with something she couldn't name. "Ms. Kane probably has more important things to worry about than your artwork, buddy," Michael said as he approached. "Actually, I don't," Victoria found herself saying. "His drawings are quite remarkable." She meant it, but there was something else driving her words. A desire to contribute something positive to the quiet conversation between father and son, to be included in their easy intimacy rather than standing outside it like an observer. Michael looked surprised by her interest, but pleased. He gets that from his mother. She was an artist. The past tense confirmed Victoria's suspicion, and she felt a flicker of unexpected sympathy. Was she a professional artist? "Graphic designer," Michael replied. "Freelance work mostly, but she was brilliant at it. Could make anything look beautiful, even boring corporate logos." His smile was warm but edged with old pain. She always said that everything deserved to be seen clearly, even the ugly stuff. Noah had returned to his sketching, but Victoria could tell he was listening to every word. There was a practiced quality to his concentration, as if he had learned to disappear into his art, while the adults talked about things that might be too heavy for direct discussion. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to meet," Victoria said. "Yeah," Michael replied quietly. "She would have liked you too. Sarah always respected people who knew their own minds." The compliment caught Victoria off guard, partly because it felt genuine, and partly because it suggested Michael had been thinking about her character beyond their sparring session. She found herself curious about what conclusions he had drawn. "Speaking of which," Michael continued, "I wasn't sure you'd be back. Last week seemed pretty intense." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't usually struggle like that. In sparring, I mean." "Didn't look like struggling to me," Michael said. "Looked like learning. There's a difference." His tone was matter-of-fact without condescension or false encouragement. Victoria realized that he was treating her failure not as something embarrassing that needed to be minimized, but as a natural part of growth. It was a perspective she had never encountered in her professional life, where weakness was exploited, and learning moments were seen as vulnerabilities to be hidden. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted, "about fighting like someone who learned from books. And I'm not sure what to do with that observation." Michael leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? When did you start training?" "I was 15. My father thought martial arts would give me discipline and focus for business." "Did you enjoy it?" Victoria paused, surprised by the question. "I was good at it. I advanced quickly." "That's not what I asked." The distinction forced Victoria to examine memories she hadn't revisited in years. Her early training had been driven by her father's expectations and her own competitive nature. Success had felt good, but enjoyment. That was a more complicated question. "I enjoyed winning," she said finally. "Most people do," Michael replied. "But what about the training itself? The process of learning?" Victoria found herself thinking about those early years trying to separate achievement from experience. "I remember being frustrated a lot, wanting to advance faster than the system allowed, feeling like the other students were holding me back." "You were training to get somewhere instead of training to be present," Michael observed. "It's a common problem with high achievers. You turn everything into a performance instead of an experience." The analysis was uncomfortably accurate. Victoria had approached martial arts the same way she approached everything else, as a series of objectives to be conquered as efficiently as possible. The idea of training for its own sake without a specific goal in mind felt alien and somehow wasteful. "Is that what you were doing?" she asked. "Last week, I mean. Teaching me to be present." Michael's smile returned. "I was sparring with you. What you learned was up to you." Other students began arriving for the evening class, and Victoria found herself reluctant to end the conversation. There was something about Michael's perspective that challenged assumptions she hadn't even realized she was making. But the demands of teaching called, and she moved to prepare for the formal session. As the class progressed through warm-ups and basic techniques, Victoria found herself watching Michael and Noah from the corner of her eye. The boy had put away his sketch pad and was observing the training with quiet attention. Occasionally, he would shift position to get a better view of a particular technique, his movements unconsciously mirroring some of what he saw. "He's interested," Victoria commented to Michael during a brief break between exercises. "Very," Michael agreed, "but I'm not sure this is the right environment for him." Victoria looked around the dojo, trying to see it through a child's eyes. Her adult students were serious and focused, treating their training with the reverence of a religious practice. It was an atmosphere that demanded maturity and self-discipline. "There are children's programs," she offered. "I don't teach them personally, but we have qualified instructors." "It's not about qualification," Michael said carefully. "It's about fit. Noah's been through a lot. He needs something gentler than most martial arts programs offer." Victoria found herself thinking about the boy's drawings, the way he captured emotional nuance in simple pencil strokes. There was a sensitivity there that might not thrive in a typical children's class, with its emphasis on discipline and achievement. What if he just observed for a while, she suggested. No pressure to participate, just exposure to the environment. Michael looked surprised by the offer. You'd be okay with that? I think your son sees things most people miss, Victoria replied. That kind of perspective might be valuable to have around. It was an unusual arrangement completely outside her normal protocols. But something about Noah's quiet presence felt like it belonged in the dojo, even if she couldn't articulate why. After class, as students filtered out, and Michael returned to his cleaning duties, Victoria found herself lingering. She went through her own training routine, practicing kata with the precision that had earned her recognition across 3 continents. But tonight, Michael's words echoed in her mind. You fight like someone who learned from books instead of experience. She tried to feel the movements rather than simply execute them, to be present in her body, instead of focused on perfect form. It was surprisingly difficult. Her mind kept wanting to analyze and critique, to measure her performance against established standards. You're thinking too hard, Michael observed from across the room. Victoria paused mid-technique. Excuse me, that kata. You're performing it instead of experiencing it, like you're afraid someone's going to grade you. The observation stung because it was accurate. Even alone in her own dojo, Victoria found herself training as if she were being evaluated. It was a mindset so ingrained, she hadn't even realized it was there. How do you experience a kata instead of performing it? She asked. Michael set down his cleaning supplies and walked onto the training floor. Mind if I show you something? Victoria nodded, curious despite herself. Pick a kata you know well, Michael said. Something you could do in your sleep. Victoria chose a basic form, one she had learned in her first year of training. Her muscle memory could execute it flawlessly, without conscious thought. Now close your eyes and do it again, Michael instructed. But this time, don't think about the movements. Think about why they exist, what they're defending against what they're trying to accomplish. Victoria closed her eyes and began the kata again. Without the ability to check her form in the mirrors, she had to rely on internal awareness. She tried to imagine the attacks her movements were designed to counter the spaces she was trying to control. Feel the application. Michael's voice guided her. Each movement has a purpose beyond looking correct. Find that purpose. As Victoria progressed through the form, something shifted in her awareness. The movements began to feel less like choreography and more like conversation. Responses to threats she could almost sense in the darkness behind her closed lids. Her technique remained precise, but it gained a fluidity that felt more organic, more alive. When she finished and opened her eyes, Michael was nodding approvingly. Better. You were actually fighting instead of dancing. Victoria felt oddly breathless, as if the kata had required more energy when performed with intention than when executed purely for form. That felt different. Most people learn martial arts backwards, Michael explained. They start with the movements and hope to understand the applications later. But the movements only make sense when you understand what you're trying to accomplish. Is that how you learned? Michael's expression grew distant. I learned the hard way. Life or death situations don't give you time to remember the proper technique. You do what works, or you don't go home. There was something in his tone that made Victoria want to ask more questions, but also warned her not to push. Whatever experiences had shaped Michael's understanding of combat were clearly painful ones. The fire department, she asked gently. Among other things. Michael's smile returned, but it was edged with something she couldn't identify. Let's just say I had some very effective teachers. Before Victoria could respond, Noah appeared at the edge of the training floor. He had been sitting so quietly that she had almost forgotten he was there. "Dad," he said softly. "It's time." Michael glanced at the clock and nodded. "Right. Sorry, Noah. Lost track of time." As father and son prepared to leave, Noah approached Victoria with another folded paper. This time it wasn't a drawing, but an origami crane perfectly formed from what looked like notebook paper. "This is for you," he said. "Dad says giving someone a crane means you want them to be happy." Victoria accepted the delicate paper bird, struck by the precision of its folds and the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you, Noah. This is beautiful." The boy smiled, the first completely uninhibited expression she had seen from him, and ran back to his father. As they headed for the door, Victoria heard Noah ask, "Dad, why does the lady always look sad when she thinks no one's watching?" Michael's response was too quiet for her to hear, but she saw him glance back at her with an expression that suggested Noah's observation had surprised him too. After they left, Victoria stood alone in her dojo, holding a paper crane and feeling like something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself. A child had seen through her carefully maintained facade to something she hadn't even realized was visible. The idea that her sadness was apparent to an 8-year-old boy was both humbling and terrifying. She walked to her office and placed the crane on her desk, next to Noah's drawing from the previous week. The two pieces of art seemed to anchor something in the sterile perfection of her workspace, adding warmth to a room designed for intimidation and control. Victoria found herself thinking about Sarah Rowan, the woman who had taught her son to fold cranes when he was sad. What kind of person created beauty as a response to pain? What kind of mother raised a child who could see sadness in strangers and respond with gifts, more importantly? What kind of loss had taken such a person from the world and left her husband and son to navigate grief alone? As Victoria locked up the dojo that night, she realized that her questions about Michael Rowan had multiplied rather than diminished. Each answer revealed new mysteries, new depths to explore. For someone who prided herself on understanding people quickly and completely, the complexity of this quiet man and his thoughtful son was both frustrating and fascinating. The drive home took her through the heart of Seattle, past the gleaming towers that housed her various business interests. Normally, the sight of her empire filled Victoria with satisfaction and purpose. Tonight, the buildings seemed like monuments to something she was beginning to question. She had built her life on the premise that strength meant control, that success meant domination, that vulnerability was weakness to be hidden or eliminated. But Michael Rowan seemed to operate from entirely different assumptions. His strength was quiet rather than forceful, his success measured in his son's well-being rather than external achievements. Most unsettling of all, his willingness to acknowledge pain and loss, to fold paper cranes when sad, suggested a kind of courage that Victoria had never considered. The courage to be present with difficult emotions rather than conquering or avoiding them. In her penthouse apartment, surrounded by the trappings of her success, Victoria found herself studying Noah's paper crane by the light of the city skyline. The delicate folds seemed impossibly precise for a child's hands. But more than that, they represented a philosophy she was only beginning to understand. Creating beauty in response to sadness, finding strength in gentleness, offering gifts instead of taking victories. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria Kane wondered if she had been measuring her life by the wrong standards entirely. And for the first time since she was 15 years old, she found herself curious about what she might discover if she stopped performing long enough to actually experience what it meant to be herself. The paper crane sat on her nightstand as she fell asleep, a small reminder that some kinds of strength required no armor at all. The paper crane had become a talisman of sorts, sitting on Victoria's desk, where she could see it during board meetings and conference calls. 3 weeks had passed since Noah had given it to her, 3 weeks of Tuesday evenings that had begun to reshape her understanding of strength and vulnerability. She found herself looking forward to those sessions with an anticipation that felt foreign and somehow dangerous. On this particular Tuesday, Victoria arrived at the dojo to find an unexpected crowd. Word had spread through Seattle's martial arts community about the Kane Dojo's advanced program, and tonight brought visitors from 3 other schools. Among them was Sensei Hiroshi Tanaka, a 7th Dan master whose reputation for technical perfection was matched only by his reputation for crushing egos. Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being evaluated by peers. In the martial arts world, reputation was everything, and tonight her teaching would be scrutinized by some of the most respected practitioners in the Pacific Northwest. As students filtered in for the evening session, Victoria noticed Michael working quietly in the background, preparing the space with his usual methodical care. Noah sat in his customary spot, but tonight he seemed more withdrawn, his sketch pad held close to his chest, as if protecting himself from the increased scrutiny of strangers. "Ms. Kane," Sensei Tanaka approached with the formal bearing that marked old-school traditionalists. "Thank you for allowing us to observe your program. Your reputation precedes you." "The honor is mine, Sensei," Victoria replied, bowing appropriately. "I hope our training proves worthy of your time." But even as she spoke the polite words, Victoria felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. These visitors had come to see the legendary Victoria Kane in action, to witness the technical mastery that had earned her recognition across 3 continents. They expected perfection, precision, and the kind of dominating presence that had built her reputation. The formal class began with traditional warm-ups and basic techniques. Victoria moved through the instruction with her usual crisp authority, demonstrating applications with the textbook precision that had always been her trademark. Her students responded with the disciplined focus they had learned over months and years of training under her demanding standards. "Excellent form," murmured one of the visiting instructors. "Very classical approach." Victoria should have felt pleased by the approval, but instead she found herself thinking about Michael's words from the previous week. "You're performing it instead of experiencing it." Even as she executed perfect techniques, she felt disconnected from the movements, going through motions that felt increasingly hollow. As the class progressed to more advanced applications, Sensei Tanaka requested permission to participate directly. "If I may, Ms. Kane, I would like to feel your technique personally. Observation has its limitations." Victoria nodded, recognizing the request for what it was, a test disguised as curiosity. Tanaka was known for his ability to expose weaknesses in other instructors' technique, often leaving visiting senseis humiliated in front of their own students. They moved to the center of the training floor, bowing formally, before beginning their demonstration. Tanaka attacked with the kind of precise, aggressive technique that marked a true master. Fast enough to be dangerous, controlled enough to be safe, skilled enough to reveal any flaws in Victoria's response. Victoria moved through her defensive sequences with mechanical precision, redirecting his attacks with the textbook applications she had perfected over 12 years of study. Each technique was correctly executed, properly, timed, appropriately powered. To the observing students, it looked like a masterful display of classical Aikido. But Victoria could feel the difference between this and her sparring sessions with Michael. Against Tanaka, she was performing a choreographed dance of attack and defense. With Michael, she had been forced to respond to something real and unpredictable. "Very good," Tanaka said, as they concluded their demonstration. "Your technical knowledge is quite impressive. classical form at its finest. The compliment should have satisfied her, but Victoria heard the subtle qualification in his tone. Classical form, textbook technique, perfect execution of established patterns. It was praise that somehow felt like limitation. As the visiting instructors prepared to leave, one of them paused near where Michael was returning cleaning equipment to storage. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone carrying the casual dismissal that marked someone addressing service staff. "Could you make sure the changing area is properly cleaned? Someone spilled coffee earlier." Michael looked up from his work, his expression neutral. "Of course. I'll take care of it right away." But Sensei Tanaka had overheard the exchange, and his attention focused on Michael with the predatory interest of someone who sensed opportunity for entertainment. "You work here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make the question feel like an accusation. "I do," Michael replied simply. "Ever train?" Tanaka pressed. "You move like someone with experience." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. She could see where this was heading, and every instinct told her to intervene. But before she could speak, Michael answered with that same calm tone that had first caught her attention. "A little, here and there." Tanaka's smile was sharp as a blade. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate. It's always interesting to see how amateur practitioners interpret classical technique." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Tanaka was offering Michael the chance to embarrass himself in front of a room full of black belts to be put in his place by someone who understood the proper order of things. "I appreciate the offer," Michael said, "but I'm working. Maybe another time." "Come now." Tanaka pressed his voice, taking on the tone of someone extending false generosity. "Ms. Kane won't mind if you take a few minutes to show us what you've learned. Will you, Ms. Kane?" Victoria found herself trapped between competing loyalties. Refusing Tanaka's request would seem protective of her employee, implying weakness, but allowing it felt like throwing Michael to the wolves for the entertainment of visitors who had already seen what they came to see. "If Michael is comfortable with it," she heard herself saying. "I have no objection." Michael looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw something flicker in his expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or recognition of betrayal. Then that calm smile returned. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" As Michael changed into a borrowed GI, Victoria caught sight of Noah in the observation area. The boy was watching the proceedings with the kind of intense attention that suggested he understood more about the social dynamics at play than his age should have allowed. His sketchpad lay forgotten in his lap, his small hands clenched into fists. "This should be educational," Tanaka murmured to his colleagues. "I always enjoy reminding people of their proper place." Victoria felt sick. She had allowed this situation to develop out of cowardice, unwilling to challenge Tanaka's authority in front of other instructors. Now Michael was about to be humiliated as a form of casual entertainment, and she was complicit in it. When Michael returned to the training floor, Tanaka was already warming up with the kind of elaborate stretching routine designed to intimidate opponents. Michael simply stood quietly, hands at his sides, apparently unconcerned by the spectacle he was about to provide. "Any particular type of sparring you prefer?" Tanaka asked with false courtesy. "I'm happy to accommodate your experience level." "Whatever works for you," Michael replied. "I mop floors, not egos." The comment was delivered so casually that it took a moment for its meaning to register. When it did, Tanaka's expression darkened. He had expected nervous deference from the janitor, not quiet confidence that bordered on dismissal. "Very well," Tanaka said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Let's see what you can do." They bowed and began to circle each other. Victoria found herself holding her breath, torn between hoping Michael would acquit himself well and fearing what Tanaka might do to someone who had just insulted his ego. Tanaka opened with a testing probe, a quick grab that was designed to gauge his opponent's speed and reaction time. It should have been easily handled by anyone with legitimate training and easily overwhelming for someone out of their depth. Michael wasn't there when the grab arrived. He had moved with the same fluid timing that Victoria remembered from their first encounter, slipping around Tanaka's attack with minimal effort. The technique missed completely, leaving Tanaka slightly off balance and visibly confused. Tanaka reset and tried again, this time with more commitment. He launched a series of attacks designed to overwhelm an inexperienced opponent, forcing them into defensive reactions that would reveal their limitations. Each attack found only empty space. Michael flowed around Tanaka's techniques like water around stones, never blocking, never countering, simply ensuring that he wasn't where the attacks were aimed. His movement was economical and efficient, wasting no energy on unnecessary motion. Victoria could see the frustration building in Tanaka's face. This wasn't how the demonstration was supposed to go. The janitor should have been overwhelmed within the first 30 seconds, reduced to clumsy defensive reactions that would highlight the difference between real training and amateur dabbling. Instead, Tanaka found himself pursuing an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move. It was like fighting smoke. No matter how precisely he attacked, there was nothing solid to connect with. "Stand still and fight." Tanaka snapped, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I am fighting," Michael replied, his breathing still calm and controlled. "You're just attacking where I was, not where I am." The observation was delivered without malice, but it cut Tanaka's pride like a razor. He was being made to look foolish by a maintenance worker in front of colleagues who would carry the story back to dojos across the city. Tanaka's next attack came with real aggression behind it, the kind of force that could cause serious injury if not properly controlled. Victoria started to move forward, ready to intervene, but Michael had already responded. What happened next would replay in Victoria's mind for months to come. Michael didn't avoid this attack. Instead, he stepped into it, blending with Tanaka's aggressive movement, until suddenly the visiting master found himself being redirected by his own momentum. Michael's hands provided just enough pressure to guide Tanaka's energy, turning the attack into a throw that sent the 7th Dan master tumbling across the mat. Tanaka hit the ground hard, but controlled his years of training, preventing injury. But as he rolled back to his feet, his face was flushed with humiliation and rage. "Lucky," he snarled. "Let's see you do that again." "I'd rather not," Michael said calmly. "You're getting angry, and angry people make mistakes that hurt everyone." "Are you afraid?" Tanaka demanded. Michael considered the question seriously. "Of you, no. Of what you might do if you lose control completely, yeah, a little." The honesty of the answer seemed to deflate some of Tanaka's rage. He looked around the dojo, seeing the shocked faces of students and visiting instructors who had just witnessed a maintenance worker outmaneuver one of the region's most respected masters. "Who are you?" Tanaka asked quietly. "Michael Rowan," came the simple reply. "And I really do need to get back to work now." As Michael bowed and walked toward the changing area, Victoria found herself studying the faces of the visiting instructors. They looked like people trying to process something that didn't fit their understanding of how the world worked. Tanaka himself seemed torn between admiration and humiliation, unsure how to react to being so thoroughly outclassed by someone he had expected to dominate. "Where did you find him?" one of the visitors asked Victoria quietly. "He found me," Victoria replied, realizing as she said it that it was completely true. After the visitors left, Victoria found herself alone in the dojo with Michael and Noah. The boy had returned to his sketching, But Victoria could see the tension in his small shoulders, the way he held his pencil too tightly. "I'm sorry," she said to Michael as he finished changing back into his work clothes. "I should have stopped that." "Why?" Michael asked. "Tanaka needed to learn something and I needed to be reminded of something." "What did you need to be reminded of?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on Noah. That protecting what matters sometimes means accepting consequences you'd rather avoid. Victoria followed his gaze to his son, understanding suddenly that Michael's demonstration hadn't been about pride or proving himself. It had been about showing Noah that strength could be quiet, that dignity didn't require aggression, that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies was to let them defeat themselves. "Noah," Victoria called softly, "what are you drawing tonight?" The boy looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "My dad," he said, "being brave." Victoria felt her throat tighten. The child had seen through the adult politics to the essential truth of what had just occurred. His father had faced down a bully not for his own ego, but to teach his son that quiet strength was still strength. "Can I see it?" Victoria asked. Noah brought his sketch pad over, and Victoria found herself looking at another masterpiece of childhood perception. He had drawn his father in the moment of redirecting Tanaka's attack, but he had captured something that the adult observers had missed. In Noah's drawing, Michael wasn't fighting at all. He was dancing, moving in harmony with forces larger than himself, finding strength in flexibility rather than resistance. "Your dad is very brave," Victoria agreed, "and very wise. He gets sad sometimes," Noah said, echoing his words from previous weeks. "But he's never scared." Victoria looked at Michael, who was pretending not to listen while organizing cleaning supplies. She wondered what experiences had shaped a man who could face down trained fighters without fear, but who carried sadness like a weight that never quite lifted. "Noah," she said carefully, "would you like to learn some of what your father knows? Not the fighting part, but the dancing part." The boy's eyes widened. "Could I?" Victoria looked at Michael, who had stopped pretending not to listen. "I was thinking we might try something different. Less formal instruction, more exploration. Focus on movement and awareness rather than technique and tradition." "You'd do that?" Michael asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I think your son has things to teach us too," Victoria replied. "About seeing clearly, about finding beauty in difficult situations." Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine. It would have to be different from regular classes. Noah's been through. He needs gentleness more than discipline. "Then we'll be gentle," Victoria said simply. As they prepared to leave that night, Noah approached Victoria with another origami crane. This one was folded from colored paper, bright yellow, like sunshine. "This one's for being kind to my dad," he said. "The yellow means happiness." Victoria accepted the crane, adding it to the small collection that was growing on her desk. "Thank you, Noah. You know, I think I'd like to learn how to fold these myself." "It's easy," Noah said. "You just have to remember that every fold matters, even the small ones." After they left, Victoria stood alone in her dojo thinking about folds that mattered and strength that didn't require armor. The encounter with Tanaka had revealed something about herself that she didn't particularly like. A willingness to sacrifice others to maintain her own position, a cowardice dressed up as political necessity. But it had also shown her something else. Michael's quiet dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation, his refusal to respond to aggression with aggression, had been more powerful than any display of technical superiority. He had won without fighting, had defended without attacking, had taught without lecturing. Most importantly, he had shown his son that strength and gentleness weren't opposites, but partners, that the highest form of courage was the willingness to remain true to yourself even when others tried to diminish you. As Victoria locked up that night, she found herself thinking about the difference between performing strength and embodying it. For 18 years, she had built her life around the performance, creating an image of invulnerability that kept the world at a safe distance. But watching Michael move through Tanaka's attacks like water through stone, she had seen what authentic strength looked like. It didn't need to announce itself or prove its worth. It simply existed quiet and unshakable, present in moments of testing and gentle in moments of teaching. The drive home took Victoria through neighborhoods she rarely visited, areas where people lived smaller lives than her penthouse existence allowed. She found herself wondering about the families behind the lighted windows, the ordinary struggles and quiet victories that never made it into business magazines or success stories. Somewhere in one of these neighborhoods, Michael Rowan was tucking his son into bed, perhaps folding paper cranes together, or talking about the lessons of the evening. Their apartment wouldn't have marble floors or designer furniture, but it would have something Victoria's penthouse lacked: the warmth that came from love given freely and strength shared generously. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Kane found herself envying someone who had less money, less power, and fewer options than she did. Not because she wanted to trade places, but because she wanted to understand how someone could carry loss with such grace, how they could face humiliation with such dignity, how they could teach strength through gentleness rather than dominance. The yellow crane sat on her nightstand beside its white predecessor, two small reminders that happiness and sadness could exist in the same space, that strength could be folded from something as delicate as paper and as simple as kindness. As she fell asleep that night, Victoria found herself wondering what it would feel like to stop performing her life and start living it instead. The question followed her into dreams where she moved like water and folded light into birds that could carry away all the sadness she had been too afraid to acknowledge. The dreams stayed with Victoria for days, fragments of movement and light that lingered at the edges of her consciousness during board meetings and conference calls. She found herself distracted in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks before her attention, drifting from profit margins to paper cranes, from quarterly projections to the quiet wisdom in a child's eyes. By Friday, she had made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of her usual weekend routine of reviewing reports and preparing for the coming week, Victoria found herself at a craft store in downtown Seattle, standing in front of displays of origami paper with the bewildered expression of someone venturing into completely foreign territory. "Can I help you find something?" asked a young clerk with purple hair and paint-stained fingers. "I want to learn to fold paper cranes." Victoria said the words, feeling strange in her mouth. "I have no idea where to start." The clerk's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, that's wonderful. Cranes are challenging but so rewarding. Let me show you what you'll need." 20 minutes later, Victoria left the store with packages of origami paper in various colors, an instruction book, and a sense of embarking on something that felt both trivial and monumentally important. The idea of Victoria Kane, billionaire CEO, sitting in her penthouse apartment, learning to fold paper birds, was absurd enough to make her question her own sanity. But as she spread the delicate sheets of paper across her marble dining table that evening, something about the process felt right in a way that closed-door negotiations and hostile takeovers never had. The instructions were precise but forgiving, requiring patience rather than aggression, technique rather than dominance. Her first attempts were disasters. The paper tore under her impatient fingers, the folds refused to align properly, and what should have been elegant cranes looked more like abstract sculptures of frustration. Victoria Kane, who had mastered complex martial arts forms and intricate business strategies, found herself defeated by colored paper and geometric precision. She was about to abandon the effort when she remembered Noah's words. You just have to remember that every fold matters, even the small ones. Victoria started over this time, slowing down, paying attention to each crease and corner. She thought about Michael's movement during their sparring sessions, the way he seemed to work with forces rather than against them. She tried to apply that same principle to the paper guiding, rather than forcing, suggesting, rather than demanding. Her fourth attempt produced something that actually resembled a crane, albeit a lopsided one with uneven wings. Victoria found herself staring at the imperfect creation with a sense of accomplishment that felt completely disproportionate to the achievement. It was just folded paper after all. But it was also something she had made with her own hands, something that existed because she had been patient enough to let it emerge. The weekend passed in a haze of paper and concentration. Victoria folded crane after crane, each one slightly better than the last, each one teaching her something about the relationship between intention and result. She discovered that rushing led to tears, that forcing led to asymmetry, that the most beautiful birds emerged when she trusted the process, rather than trying to control every aspect of the outcome. By Sunday evening, her dining table was covered with a flock of paper cranes in every color imaginable. Some were perfect, some were charmingly imperfect. All were evidence of hours spent in a state of mind that Victoria had never experienced before. Complete absorption in an activity that served no strategic purpose and generated no measurable profit. Monday morning brought the return of her usual schedule, but Victoria found herself carrying one of the cranes in her briefcase, a small reminder of the peace she had discovered in patient creation. During a particularly contentious budget meeting, she found her fingers tracing the bird's folded wings beneath the conference table, using its presence to center herself in ways that years of meditation apps had never achieved. Tuesday evening arrived with the weight of anticipation that had become familiar over the past month. But tonight felt different, charged with possibility, in ways that Victoria couldn't quite articulate. She arrived at the dojo early, her gym bag containing not just workout clothes, but a small package of origami paper and 3 of her weekend's creations. Noah was already in his usual spot, but tonight he wasn't alone. A girl about his age sat beside him, their heads bent together over his sketch pad, in the kind of intense collaboration that marked true friendship. The girl had long black hair and wore glasses that seemed too large for her delicate face. "That's Emma," Michael explained as he approached Victoria. "Noah's friend from school. Her mom's working late tonight, so I told her she could hang out here until pickup time. Hope that's okay." Victoria found herself nodding, though the sight of 2 children in her pristine dojo should have triggered her usual concerns about liability and protocol. Instead, she felt curious about what Noah might have told his friend about their Tuesday evening routine. "What are they working on?" she asked. "Emma's teaching Noah some advanced origami techniques," Michael replied with a smile. "Apparently, she's something of a prodigy. Been folding since she was 4. Victoria watched as the girl demonstrated a complex series of folds to Noah, her small hands moving with the kind of precision that spoke of years of practice. There was something beautiful about their collaboration, the way Noah's artistic eye combined with Emma's technical skill to create something neither could have achieved alone. "Emma," Victoria called softly, not wanting to interrupt, but curious to meet Noah's friend. The girl looked up with bright, intelligent eyes that reminded Victoria of herself at that age. Intense, focused, slightly wary of adult attention. "Hello," she said politely. "Noah told me you're learning to fold cranes." "I am," Victoria replied, "though I suspect I'm not very good at it yet." "Nobody's good at first," Emma said matter-of-factly. It's like learning to read. You have to make mistakes before you can do it right. The simple wisdom of the observation struck Victoria as profound. In her professional life, mistakes were weaknesses to be hidden, failures to be minimized or blamed on others. The idea that errors might be necessary steps in learning, rather than evidence of inadequacy, was both foreign and oddly liberating. "Would you like to see what we're working on?" Emma asked with the generous spirit that marked truly confident children. Victoria approached their workspace and found herself looking at origami creations that defied her understanding of what was possible with folded paper. Emma had created a dragon so detailed and lifelike that it seemed ready to take flight, while Noah had folded a crane that appeared to be in mid-dance, its wings spread in a gesture of pure joy. "These are incredible," Victoria said, meaning it completely. "How long have you been learning?" "Emma's been teaching me the hard stuff," Noah replied. "But she says the most important thing isn't being perfect. It's understanding what you're trying to say." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked. Emma adjusted her glasses with the serious expression of someone preparing to explain something important. "Every fold tells a story. Like if you're sad, your crane will look different than if you're happy. The paper knows how you're feeling." Victoria thought about her weekend of folding, remembering how her emotional state had seemed to influence the results. The cranes she had made while frustrated were angular and tight, while those created in moments of calm had flowing, graceful lines. "Can you show me?" Victoria asked. The evening that followed was unlike any in Victoria's memory. Instead of formal martial arts instruction, she found herself sitting cross-legged on the training floor with two children and their father, learning advanced origami techniques and discovering that paper could indeed hold emotion in its folds. Emma proved to be a patient teacher, breaking down complex forms into manageable steps and offering encouragement when Victoria's businessman's fingers struggled with the delicate work. Noah contributed artistic insights, suggesting color combinations and modifications that transformed functional designs into objects of beauty. But it was Michael's presence that anchored the experience, his quiet attention to his son and his friend, creating a sense of safety that allowed everyone to experiment without fear of judgment. He folded his own creations, simple but elegant birds that spoke of steady hands and patient practice, while keeping one eye on the children and another on Victoria's growing collection of imperfect masterpieces. "Tell me about your crane," Emma said to Victoria as she completed a particularly challenging design. "What story is it telling?" Victoria studied the blue and silver bird in her hands, noting the way the wings seemed to reach toward something just out of view. "I think it's about wanting to fly, but being afraid to leave the ground." Noah nodded seriously. "That's a good story. Scared cranes are important too." The acceptance in his voice brought unexpected tears to Victoria's eyes. In her world, fear was something to be conquered or hidden, not acknowledged as a valid part of the human experience. But these children seemed to understand that emotions weren't enemies to be defeated, but messengers to be heard. As the evening progressed, their origami session evolved into something deeper. Emma shared stories about her mother's long work hours and her own dreams of becoming an artist. Noah talked about missing his mother, but finding joy in the memories she had left behind. Michael spoke quietly about the importance of creating beauty in response to pain, of finding light in dark places. Victoria found herself opening up in ways that felt both terrifying and necessary. She talked about the loneliness of success, about the weight of constant performance, about the fear that beneath all her achievements lay nothing but emptiness. "Maybe that's why you like folding cranes," Emma suggested with the directness that only children could manage. "Because they're beautiful, but also sad, and sometimes being both things at once is the most honest way to be. The observation hit Victoria like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. She had spent so many years trying to be one thing, strong, successful, invulnerable, that she had forgotten it was possible to be multiple things simultaneously. "I think you're very wise, Emma," Victoria said. "My mom says wisdom is just being willing to see things clearly even when they're complicated." Emma replied, then returned her attention to teaching Noah a new folding technique. As the official class time arrived, and adult students began filtering in, Victoria found herself reluctant to end their impromptu origami session. But the demands of teaching called, and she moved to prepare for the formal training. Tonight's class proceeded with unusual energy. Perhaps influenced by the creativity that had filled the early evening, Victoria found herself encouraging experimentation rather than demanding perfect replication. She invited students to explore applications, rather than simply memorizing forms, to find their own paths through techniques, rather than following predetermined patterns. "Sensei," asked David Kim during a break between exercises, "you seem different lately, more flexible." Victoria considered the observation. "I've been learning some things about the relationship between structure and creativity, about the importance of understanding principles rather than just memorizing patterns." "From the books you mentioned last month?" asked Sarah Chen. "From some unexpected teachers," Victoria replied, glancing toward the observation area where Noah and Emma had returned to their collaborative art-making. As the class concluded and students began to leave, Victoria noticed that Michael was taking longer than usual with his end-of-evening duties. When the last student had gone, she found him in the equipment storage area sitting on the floor, with his back against the wall and his head in his hands. "Michael," Victoria approached cautiously, recognizing the posture of someone carrying more weight than they could bear. "Are you all right?" He looked up with eyes that held a depth of sadness she had glimpsed before, but never seen so clearly. "Just tired," he said, but his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "Is it Noah? Is he okay?" "Noah's fine," Michael replied quickly. "Better than fine, actually. Tonight was good for him. It's just—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging between them like an unfinished origami fold. Victoria found herself settling onto the floor beside him, abandoning the formal distance she usually maintained with employees. "It's just what—" she asked gently. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands, as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Do you ever feel like you're failing at the most important job you'll ever have?" The question caught Victoria off guard, both because of its vulnerability and because of how closely it echoed her own recent self-doubts. "You mean parenting?" Sarah was the artist. Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was the one who knew how to nurture creativity, how to help Noah see beauty in everything. I fix things that are broken and clean up messes. I don't know how to be enough for him." Victoria felt her heart break for this man, who had seemed so strong, so certain of his place in the world. "Michael, your son adores you. Anyone can see that." "But is adoration enough?" Michael asked. "Tonight, watching him with Emma, seeing how he lit up when you paid attention to his art, I realized how much he's been missing. The kind of creative support his mother would have given him. The kind of person who understands that making beautiful things matters." "You fold cranes with him," Victoria pointed out. "You taught him that art can heal sadness." "Sarah taught me that," Michael corrected. "I'm just passing along her wisdom. But what happens when Noah outgrows what I can give him? What happens when he needs more than I know how to provide?" Victoria found herself thinking about Emma's earlier observation about the importance of being multiple things at once. Maybe the answer isn't about being enough by yourself. Maybe it's about building a community of people who can offer different kinds of support. Michael looked at her with surprise. Is that an offer? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Victoria hadn't fully considered when she spoke. Was she offering to be part of Noah's support system? Was she suggesting a relationship that extended beyond Tuesday evening encounters? I think, Victoria said carefully, that Noah has taught me as much as I could ever teach him, and I think there's value in learning from each other, in creating spaces where different kinds of wisdom can flourish. Even though I'm just the janitor and you're the billionaire CEO, Michael asked, but there was humor in his voice now rather than bitterness. Especially because of that, Victoria replied. I need to learn how to create beauty from simple things. And maybe Noah needs to see that success doesn't have to mean losing sight of what matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who had found themselves in unexpected territory, navigating the space between professional boundaries and personal connection. Around them, the dojo held its usual peace, but tonight it felt different, less like a temple to perfection, and more like a sanctuary for growth. Victoria, Michael said finally, using her first name for the first time since they had met. Would you like to get coffee sometime? Not here, not as teacher and janitor, just as people who are figuring things out. The invitation was simple but loaded with possibility. Victoria found herself thinking about all the reasons she should salt no. The complications it would create, the professional boundaries it would blur, the vulnerability it would require. Instead, she heard herself saying, I'd like that very much. As they prepared to leave that night, Noah and Emma approached with a joint creation, an origami sculpture that seemed to be part crane, part dragon, part abstract representation of flight itself. It was unlike anything Victoria had seen before, a collaboration that transcended individual technique to create something entirely new. This is for you, Noah said, offering the sculpture to Victoria, for being willing to learn new things. Victoria accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. It's beautiful. What do you call it? A hope bird, Emma replied matter-of-factly. It's for when you're ready to try flying, but you need something to help you remember you have wings. As Victoria drove home that night, the hope bird sitting carefully secured on her passenger seat, she found herself thinking about the evening's revelations. She had discovered that teaching could be learning, that strength could include vulnerability, that the most profound moments often emerged from the simplest activities. Most importantly, she had begun to understand that the walls she had built around her life, walls designed to protect her from pain and uncertainty, had also kept her from experiencing the kind of joy that came from genuine connection with others. The hope bird sat on her nightstand, beside the growing collection of paper cranes, a reminder that some flights required faith rather than control, trust rather than certainty. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria Kane found herself ready to discover what might happen if she stopped protecting herself long enough to find out who she really was beneath all the armor. The question that had haunted her for weeks, about the difference between performing strength and embodying it, seemed closer to an answer. True strength, she was beginning to understand, wasn't about having no weaknesses. It was about being brave enough to let the right people see your vulnerabilities, wise enough to accept help when it was offered, and generous enough to offer your own gifts in return. As sleep took her that night, Victoria's dreams were filled with paper birds taking flight, carrying messages of hope across skies that no longer seemed quite so vast or threatening. And somewhere in those dreams, she found herself learning to fly alongside them, discovering that the ground she had clung to for so long had never been as safe as the journey she had been too afraid to begin. The coffee invitation materialized into reality on a Saturday morning that felt suspended between seasons, with autumn's last warmth giving way to winter's first whisper. Victoria had suggested one of the upscale cafes near her office building, but Michael had countered with a small diner in Fremont that served what he claimed were the best pancakes in Seattle. The choice between familiar territory and unknown ground felt symbolic in ways that made Victoria's chest tight with anticipation. She arrived first, sliding into a worn vinyl booth that had probably seen decades of conversations, both profound and mundane. The Copper Kettle Diner was everything her usual haunts were not. Unpretentious, comfortable, filled with the kind of honest warmth that money couldn't manufacture. Truckers sat next to college students, elderly couples shared newspapers over coffee that had been brewing since dawn, and the waitress called everyone hon with genuine affection. When Michael arrived with Noah in tow, Victoria felt a flutter of surprise followed by something that might have been relief. She had been nervous about navigating a purely adult conversation, unsure how to relate to Michael outside the familiar context of the dojo. "Hope you don't mind," Michael said, as they approached the table. "Emma's family went out of town for the weekend, and I don't like leaving Noah alone for too long." "The more the merrier," Victoria replied, and meant it. Noah's presence would provide both buffer and focus, preventing the conversation from becoming too intense while ensuring it remained authentic. Noah slid into the booth beside Victoria with the easy familiarity of a child who had decided she was safe. "They have really good hot chocolate here," he informed her seriously, "with marshmallows that don't melt right away." "That sounds perfect," Victoria said, catching Michael's eye across the table. His smile was warm but cautious, the expression of someone venturing into uncertain territory with someone whose reactions he couldn't predict. The morning unfolded with surprising ease. Conversation flowed around Noah's observations about the diner's eclectic decor, Michael's stories about his early firefighting days, and Victoria's tentative sharing of her own childhood memories. She found herself talking about her father's rigid expectations, her early struggles with perfectionism, the loneliness of always being the smartest person in the room. "Sounds like you were performing pretty early," Michael observed gently. "I didn't know there was any other option," Victoria replied. "Success was the only acceptable outcome in my family. Everything else was a failure." "That's sad," Noah said, with the directness that adults had learned to soften, but children still wielded like truth. "My mom always said the best adventures happen when you don't know how they'll end." Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever Noah mentioned his mother. "She sounds like she was very wise." "She was," Noah agreed. "Dad says I have her eyes, but his stubbornness." "Guilty as charged," Michael admitted, though I prefer to call it persistence. As they talked, Victoria found herself studying the dynamic between father and son. There was an ease between them that spoke of deep trust, but also a careful gentleness that suggested they had both learned to handle fragile things with extra care. Michael's attention to Noah was complete, but never smothering, guiding, without controlling, protecting, without overprotecting. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said to Michael during a lull in conversation. "How do you do it? Balance everything, I mean. Work, parenting, your own healing. It seems impossible." Michael was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into his coffee with the methodical care he brought to everything he did. "Honestly, most days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. But Sarah used to say that the secret wasn't having all the answers. It was being willing to admit when you needed help." "Do you need help, I mean?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that Victoria wasn't sure either of them was ready to examine fully. Michael looked at her with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Everyone needs help," he said finally. "The trick is recognizing it when it comes in unexpected packages." 3 weeks later, Victoria found herself in completely unfamiliar territory. The sidelines of a youth soccer game, cheering for Noah's team with an enthusiasm that would have mystified her business associates. The invitation had come casually, Noah mentioning that he had a game on Saturday and wondering if she might want to come watch. Victoria had accepted before fully considering the implications of spending her weekend at a suburban soccer field. But as she watched Noah race across the grass with the determined intensity he brought to everything he cared about, Victoria discovered that there were forms of entertainment more satisfying than corporate networking events. The pure joy on the children's faces, the supportive cheers from parents who had nothing to gain from each other except community, the simple pleasure of celebrating effort regardless of outcome. It was a world away from the calculating atmosphere she was used to. "He's getting stronger," Michael observed, settling beside her on the aluminum bleachers with coffee from the concession stand. "More confident." Victoria watched Noah steal the ball from an opposing player and pass it skillfully to a teammate. "The art classes are helping, I think. Emma says confidence in one area builds confidence in others." The art classes had been Victoria's idea, implemented after she had witnessed Noah's talent during their origami sessions. She had quietly arranged for him to attend weekly lessons with one of Seattle's most respected children's art instructors, framing it as a scholarship program to avoid any awkwardness about charity. "You didn't have to do that," Michael had said when she first mentioned the arrangement. "We could have figured something out." "I wanted to," Victoria had replied. "Talent like his deserves nurturing. Besides, I'm learning as much from him as any teacher could provide." It was true. The Tuesday evening origami sessions had evolved into something unprecedented in Victoria's life. Time spent creating for the pure joy of creation, without agenda or expectation of return. Noah and Emma had become her teachers in the art of being present, of finding satisfaction in process rather than outcome. Now, watching Noah play with the kind of focused joy that had become his trademark, Victoria felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. She was witnessing the flowering of potential she had helped nurture, contributing to something beautiful, without needing to control or claim credit for it. "Victoria," Michael said quietly, "there's something I want to tell you. About Sarah, about what happened." Victoria felt her attention sharpen. In all their conversations over the past months, Michael had shared memories of his wife, but never the details of her loss. She had sensed the pain beneath his carefully maintained composure, but had never pushed for information he wasn't ready to share. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," Michael replied. "You've become important to us, to Noah and me, and there are things you should understand if we're going to keep whatever this is we're building." Victoria nodded, giving him space to find his words, while keeping part of her attention on Noah, who was currently engaged in an animated discussion with the referee about an alleged foul. "Sarah had cancer," Michael said simply. "Diagnosed when Noah was 4. We had 2 years to say goodbye, which was a gift and a curse at the same time. Long enough to prepare him as much as any child can be prepared, but also long enough to watch her fade away piece by piece." Victoria felt her chest tighten with sympathy and recognition. She understood now why Michael moved through the world with such careful attention to the present moment, why he treated each day with Noah as precious and finite. "The last few months were the hardest," Michael continued. "She was in so much pain, but she kept folding cranes for Noah, kept creating beauty even when everything hurt. She said she wanted to leave him with as much light as possible to balance out the darkness of losing her. She succeeded, Victoria said softly. Noah carries that light with him everywhere. Most days I think so, Michael agreed. But sometimes I wonder if I'm enough, if I can give him everything he needs to grow into the person she would have wanted him to become. Victoria thought about the boy on the soccer field, his combination of artistic sensitivity and quiet strength, his ability to see clearly and speak truth without cruelty. Michael, you're raising an extraordinary human being. Sarah would be proud of both of you. Some days I feel her approval, Michael said. Other days I feel like I'm fumbling in the dark, making it up as I go along. Maybe that's what good parenting looks like, Victoria suggested. Caring enough to worry, being brave enough to try, staying open enough to learn. Michael looked at her with surprise. You sound like you've given this a lot of thought. Victoria realized she had. Over the past months, watching Michael navigate fatherhood with such intentional care had made her examine her own relationship with guidance and growth. She had begun to understand that leadership, whether of a child, a company, or oneself, wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating space for others to find their own. I've been learning from a very good teacher, she said. The game ended with Noah's team winning 3-2, a victory that prompted celebration in the form of ice cream from a nearby truck. As Victoria watched Noah accept congratulations from teammates and parents with the kind of gracious joy that suggested solid self-esteem, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her own achievements. Ms. Kane, Noah said, approaching with chocolate ice cream decorating his smile. Will you come to our art show next month? Emma and I both have pieces in it. I wouldn't miss it, Victoria replied, meaning it completely. The art show held in the community center where Noah and Emma took their weekly classes was unlike any cultural event Victoria had ever attended. The walls were covered with the uninhibited creativity of children aged 5 to 16 works that prioritized expression over technique, joy over perfection. Parents and siblings crowded the small space, voices overlapping in excitement and pride. Victoria found Noah's contribution near the center of the main wall, a mixed media piece that combined painting, collage, and origami elements to create a landscape that seemed to exist halfway between reality and dreams. At the center of the composition, a paper crane soared above rolling hills that were made from torn magazine pages and watercolor washes. It's called Finding Home, Noah explained, appearing at her elbow with Emma close behind. It's about how home isn't just a place, but also the people who understand you. Victoria studied the piece more closely, noting the careful placement of each element, the way the crane seemed to be both departing from and arriving at the landscape below. It's beautiful, Noah, and very wise. Emma helped with the technical stuff, Noah said generously. But the idea came from watching you and Dad learn to be friends. The observation hit Victoria unexpectedly. In the months since their first coffee meeting, her relationship with Michael had evolved into something she struggled to define. It was deeper than friendship, but more complex than romance, built on shared concern for Noah, but extending into areas of mutual support and understanding that neither of them had expected. What do you mean? Victoria asked. You were both lonely before, Emma said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that marked her contributions to any conversation. But in different ways. Now you're lonely together sometimes, which is better than being lonely alone. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. The children had seen something in the developing relationship between her and Michael that the adults themselves were still trying to understand. They had recognized the careful way two damaged people were learning to trust each other, the gradual building of something that might become a foundation for healing. You're both very observant, Victoria said. Artists have to be, Noah replied seriously. Mom always said that making good art meant seeing what was really there, not just what people wanted you to see. Later that evening, after the art show had ended, and the last proud parents had departed with their young creators, Victoria found herself walking through downtown Seattle with Michael and Noah. They had started at the community center, moved to dinner at a family restaurant that specialized in comfort food, and were now wandering without destination through the city streets. This has been perfect, Victoria said, as they paused at a viewpoint overlooking Elliott Bay. The water stretched dark and peaceful before them, dotted with the lights of ferries and cargo ships pursuing their own quiet purposes. It has, Michael agreed. Noah, what did you think of your first art show? I liked seeing everyone's different ways of making beautiful things, Noah replied. But mostly I liked that you and Victoria were there together. It felt like a family might feel. The words hung in the cool evening air, honest and hopeful and terrifying in their implications. Victoria felt her carefully maintained boundaries wavering the walls she had built around her heart, developing cracks that let in both light and vulnerability. Noah, Michael said gently. Victoria has her own life, her own responsibilities. We can't expect... Actually, Victoria interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I've been thinking about that, about life and responsibilities and what really matters. She turned to face them both, these two people who had somehow become central to her existence without her quite noticing when it happened. I've spent 18 years building a life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels empty on the inside. Perfect achievements, perfect control, perfect isolation. Victoria, Michael started, but she held up a hand. Let me finish, she said. You've both taught me things I never knew I needed to learn. About strength that doesn't require armor, about success that doesn't require defeating others, about love that makes you bigger instead of smaller. Noah was watching her with those serious brown eyes that seemed to contain understanding far beyond his years. Michael's expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone afraid to hope for something he wanted too much. What I'm trying to say, Victoria continued, is that I don't want to go back to the life I had before I met you. I want to build something new, something that includes all of us, if you're willing. Like a family. Noah asked, his voice small but hopeful. Like a family. Victoria confirmed, feeling the words reshape something fundamental in her chest. If your dad thinks that's a good idea. Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her offer was real or just another performance designed to achieve a desired outcome. Are you sure? He asked finally. This isn't a business merger, Victoria. This is messy and complicated, and there are no guarantees. I'm terrified, Victoria admitted. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try. What about your company, your empire? Victoria looked out over the water, thinking about the towers of steel and glass that housed her various enterprises, the carefully constructed monument to her own ambition. It'll still be there, but maybe it doesn't have to be the only thing that defines me. Are you proposing to my dad? Noah asked, with the directness that had become his trademark. Victoria laughed, a sound that felt lighter than any she had produced in years. I'm proposing that we figure it out together, all of it. The scary parts, and the beautiful parts, and everything in between. Michael stepped closer, close enough that she could see the hope and fear warring in his expression. You know, this changes everything, right? No going back to being the untouchable Victoria Kane once you let us into your life completely. Good, Victoria said simply. I'm tired of being untouchable. 6 months later, Victoria stood at the edge of the training floor in her dojo, watching as Noah led a group of younger children through basic origami techniques. The weekly children's art and movement class had been his idea, a combination of gentle martial arts, instruction, and creative expression that drew families from across the city. "Remember," Noah was saying to a 6-year-old struggling with a complex fold, "the paper wants to be a crane. You just have to help it remember how." Victoria smiled at the wisdom in the advice, thinking about how applicable it was to most of life's challenges. She had spent so many years trying to force outcomes through willpower and strategy, never realizing that some of the most important transformations happened when you learned to work with natural tendencies rather than against them. "He's a natural teacher," Michael observed, joining her at the edge of the mat. "Patient, but encouraging. Reminds me of someone else I know." Victoria leaned into his shoulder, still surprised by how natural physical affection had become between them. The transition from friendship to something deeper had been gradual and careful, built on foundation of shared values and mutual respect rather than passionate impulse. "The demonstration's in 2 weeks," Victoria said. "Are you ready?" The statewide Aikido demonstration had been Michael's suggestion, a chance for Victoria to showcase the evolved teaching philosophy that had emerged from their months of collaboration. Instead of focusing purely on technical mastery, their demonstration would emphasize the integration of martial arts principles with creative expression, mindfulness with practical application. "As ready as I'll ever be," Michael replied. "Though I still think you're crazy for agreeing to this." "Probably," Victoria agreed. "But it's the good kind of crazy, the kind that leads to growth instead of stagnation." They had been planning the demonstration for months, working together to create something that honored traditional Aikido while incorporating the lessons they had learned about presence, creativity, and authentic strength. It would be Victoria's most public statement about the changes in her approach to martial arts and, by extension, to life itself. "Besides," Victoria added, "we've got the best secret weapon in the business." She nodded toward Noah, who was now helping the children arrange their completed cranes into a collective sculpture. His natural ability to see creative possibilities in technical challenges had become an integral part of their teaching methodology. The day of the demonstration arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Seattle's reputation for rain seem like deliberate misdirection. The venue was packed with martial artists from across the Pacific Northwest, many of whom had come specifically to see what Victoria Kane had been developing in her increasingly famous Tuesday evening sessions. Backstage, Victoria felt the familiar pre-performance butterflies that had accompanied every major presentation of her life. But tonight, the nervousness felt different. Less about fear of failure and more about excitement for the possibility of sharing something meaningful. "You've got this," Michael said, checking the ties on his GI one final time. "Just remember what we practiced. Trust the process, stay present, let the techniques emerge naturally." Victoria nodded, thinking about how different this felt from the rigid demonstrations of her past. Tonight, instead of showcasing perfect execution of predetermined forms, they would be having a genuine conversation, through movement responding to each other's energy in real time. Places everyone called the event coordinator. As they walked onto the demonstration floor, Victoria caught sight of Noah in the front row of the audience, sitting between Emma and her mother. He held up a small origami crane, rainbow-colored his latest technical achievement, and mouthed "good luck" with the kind of confident smile that suggested he had no doubt about the outcome. The demonstration began with individual kata, each participant moving through solo forms that showcased their technical foundation. Victoria's performance was crisp and controlled the product of 18 years of dedicated training. But as she moved through the familiar sequences, she found herself thinking, not about perfect execution, but about the stories the movements were telling. Then came the partner work, the real test of everything they had been developing together. Victoria and Michael began with basic techniques, establishing rhythm and connection, before moving into more complex applications. What emerged was something that transcended mere martial arts demonstration. It was a conversation between two people who had learned to trust each other completely, a dance of give and take that showcased strength through cooperation rather than domination. The audience fell silent as they moved through sequences that blended traditional Aikido with innovations born from their months of collaborative exploration. Victoria found herself responding to Michael's energy with an intuition that went beyond conscious thought, while he matched her technical precision with the kind of adaptive creativity that had first caught her attention in their initial encounter. "Beautiful flow," someone whispered from the audience. But Victoria barely heard the comment. She was completely absorbed in the present moment, experiencing the kind of total engagement that she had been searching for her entire life without knowing it. This was what Michael had meant about fighting from experience rather than textbook knowledge. This state of complete presence where technique and intuition merged into something greater than either could achieve alone. As they concluded their formal demonstration, the applause was immediate and sustained. But Victoria's attention was focused on Noah, whose face radiated the kind of pure joy that came from watching people you loved succeed at something important to them. "That was incredible," said one of the attending masters as they left the demonstration floor. "I've never seen such perfect integration of traditional technique with contemporary application." "Thank you," Victoria replied. "Though I should point out that what you saw was the result of collaborative development. This isn't something I could have achieved alone. It was a statement that would have been impossible for the old Victoria Kane to make. An acknowledgement that her greatest achievements had come not from individual excellence, but from learning to work with others in service of something larger than personal glory." Later that evening, as they celebrated at the same diner, where Victoria and Michael had shared their first real conversation, Noah presented them with his latest creation, an origami sculpture that seemed to be part crane, part dragon, part abstract representation of movement itself. "What do you call this one?" Victoria asked, accepting the delicate creation with hands that trembled slightly from the evening's exertion. "A family bird," Noah replied matter-of-factly. "It's for when people who used to be separate learn how to fly together." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes as she studied the sculpture. Like all of Noah's art, it captured something essential about the human experience. In this case, the way that connection could transform individual limitations into collective strength. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it completely. "Just like us," Michael added, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own. As they sat together in the warm glow of the diner's lights, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of families sharing meals and stories, Victoria marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who measured her worth in quarterly reports and competitive victories, who had built her identity around the ability to control outcomes through superior strategy and ruthless execution. Now she was part of something messier and more beautiful than anything she had previously imagined possible. She was learning to find strength in vulnerability, success in collaboration, joy in the simple act of creating beauty alongside people she loved. The paper crane from that first evening still sat on her desk at the office, joined now by dozens of others in every color and complexity imaginable. They had become symbols of transformation, reminders that the most profound changes often began with the smallest acts of courage, the willingness to fold something new from the raw material of what had been. "So what's next?" Michael asked as they prepared to leave the diner. Victoria looked at Noah, who was carefully packing his art supplies with the methodical care he brought to everything important, and then at Michael, whose steady presence had become the foundation for her own growth into someone she actually liked being. "I don't know," she said, and for the first time in her adult life, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. "I guess we'll figure it out together." As they walked out into the Seattle night, Noah between them holding both their hands, Victoria found herself thinking about the difference between control and trust, between performing strength and embodying it. She had spent 18 years trying to write the story of her life in advance, plotting every chapter and predicting every outcome. Now she was learning the joy of improvisation, of allowing the story to emerge through the choices she made moment by moment, in partnership with people who saw her clearly and loved her anyway. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and more real than anything she had ever experienced. The city lights sparkled around them like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance a fairy horn sounded its deep note of arrival and departure. Victoria Kane, no longer the Ice Phoenix, but something warmer and more human, walked toward whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer walking alone. Behind them, the dojo stood quiet and ready for tomorrow's lessons, its floors swept clean by hands that understood the dignity of honest work, its walls holding the echoes of laughter and learning growth and transformation. And in the observation area, if you looked closely, you might see a small collection of origami cranes perched on the windowsill, messengers of hope and change, reminders that the most beautiful flights often began with the simple courage to unfold.